Hi, everyone. I'm Addison Stark, Associate Director for Energy Innovation at the Bipartisan Policy Center and Staff Director for the American Energy Innovation Council. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Varun Sivaram to discuss a case study he recently wrote for our AEIC Scaling Innovation Project on the rise of utility-scale solar PV during the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. A bit about Varun. He's the author of the best-selling book, Taming the Sun, Innovations to Harness Solar Energy and Power the Planet. Recently, he returned to DC from India, where he was CTO of Renew Power Limited, India's largest renewable energy firm. And he's also currently he's a visiting senior fellow at Columbia University's Center for Global Energy Policy, a senior fellow at ITIF, and a non-resident fellow at Aspen Institute. Varun, thanks for joining me today.
Addison, thank you for having me.
So, in your paper, you look back at the role of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act and what role it played in kickstarting the solar industry. Can you talk a bit about the role that ARRA played in transforming the industry, improving the commercial viability of utility-scale solar PV? What did the industry look like pre-2009, and what does it look like today?
Thanks, Addison. Well, look, today, solar energy is the world's fastest growing source of power. It's the fastest growing in India, where I just was, and it's the fastest growing in the United States. In 2020, solar is set to generate about 2% of the country's electricity, and it's growing rapidly, over 85 gigawatts cumulatively installed by the end of this year. But a decade earlier, in 2009, none of the success was assured. Because in 2009, not a single utility-scale solar plant more than 100 megawatts was yet in operation. And so the last decade represents the step change, this remarkable decade-long solar boom. And ARRA, the Recovery Act, I believe, played an important role in enabling that. Look, in 2009, the situation was grim. The Great Recession was underway. The outlook for new investment was very limited. Moreover, because the major incentive for supporting solar power was tax incentives, and firms had very little taxable income at the time, it was hard to take advantage of government incentives, the investment tax credit. And so industry groups predicted in 2009 that the solar PV, photovoltaic market, was set to drop 30 to 50%. Now, let's be clear. At this point in 2009, solar was not a new technology. It had been over a half a century since the solar cell was invented in Bell Labs in the United States in 1954. And ever since that, solar had been deployed in a variety of different settings, in space, on offshore oil rigs, and around the world. The United States was an early leader, but then ceded leadership to Japan and Germany. And so solar had been demonstrated in a variety of commercial settings. And yet, the largest solar installations still hadn't been built. There was this gap. And the reason was investors still weren't comfortable with investing in large-scale solar power, right? The largest installations that were coming up in the United States were far less than 100 megawatts. They were on the order of 10 megawatts. And in order to surmount this gap, investors needed to feel comfortable that they had seen the construction process, the permitting process through, they had seen the financing close for a major project, and that they were comfortable with the technical due diligence that a project would actually generate the sort of electricity and therefore generate the returns needed for the investors to recoup their capital. In 2009, none of this looked possible. The Recovery Act made it possible for solar to jump over this size gap by enabling the demonstration of the first 5 large, truly large-scale solar power plants of 100 megawatts or more. And what happened was there were 2 provisions in particular of the Recovery Act that enabled this. The first, known as Section 1603, gave cash grants instead of the investment tax credit. And so, at the time, it was hard for firms to monetize the tax credit. And so the cash grants enabled money out the door to get out the door and support these solar projects, big and small. The second piece was Section 1705, the Loan Guarantee Program. It was actually an extension of the Loan Guarantee Program that allowed the Department of Energy to support projects that used technologies that were already commercially available, like solar power, but hadn't been demonstrated at a large scale, like 100 megawatts or more. And so what ultimately ended up happening was the federal government offered loan guarantees to the first 5 projects. And subsequent to this, between 2009 and 2013 and 14, these projects got built. And subsequently, the cost of solar power would fall more than 60% to under $50 a megawatt hour. And this decade-long boom would begin after the first 5 large-scale projects were demonstrated. So clearly, the Recovery Act and the Loan Program Office in particular played this pivotal role in taking us from a grim situation in 2009 to a boom, not just in the US, but around the world. And that's an example of a particular kind of demonstration project. You know, when we talk about innovation policy, we talk about supporting demonstrations of technologies to prove to the commercial marketplace that these technologies are ready for prime time. But there are, in reality, many different kinds of demonstrations. This is a particularly late stage demonstration. It's a demonstration of a technology that's been proven commercially at small scales and now needs to be proven at the largest of scales. And once the federal government stepped in and filled that gap, the first few large-scale demonstration projects, the market kind of took off on its own at the scale needed for deep decarbonization.
So, and you touched on this, but in your paper, you really do point to the Loan Programs Office as playing a very pivotal role on proving financeability. Can you talk a little bit more about the importance of the loan guarantees and also how they might be leveraged today to think about other technologies?
Yeah, that's a great question because, as you know, we are in something of a similar situation today. The COVID crisis is not an identical analog to the Great Recession. But there are clearly parallels, and we will need to, invest decisively now, and there are opportunities to do so. So what can we learn is a good question. The loan program gets a lot of notoriety because of certain investments that it made, for example, in the solar manufacturer Solindra. And to be clear, my opinion is that the Loan Programs Office actually didn't take enough risk. That it's very important when you're supporting demonstration projects to assemble a broad portfolio of technologies, some of which will fail, some of which won't. Now, perhaps the Solindra case, there are some lessons to learn. You may not want to invest as large an amount in one particular bet. But just to be clear, I think that it's important going forward that we continue to take risks. But the case with utility scale solar PV is different. Utility scale solar was already a commercially proven technology. There was actually quite a low risk in supporting these projects, which is why the federal government's actually made money off of supporting projects like these. What actually happened was the federal government had to turn into an entity that had many of the skill sets and expertise of a private sector entity. The Loan Program Office staffed up from a few dozen folks to hundreds of people, many with private sector investment backgrounds, in order to do the fundamental due diligence, the technical due diligence on these projects and convince lenders that, hey, these projects are in fact financeable. We're giving you a guarantee, not just because we're doling out government money, but because we've done the research. And that really built confidence among the financial sector. There was this one program, the FIPP, a partnership program, a consortium of 14 banks that enabled lenders, private lenders, like Bank of America, to come in and invest with the federal loan guarantee in a solar project, in this case, Desert Sunlight. And in doing so, many of these lenders would go forward and invest by themselves in their own projects without government loan guarantees after the loan guarantee program expired in 2014. Going forward, I think that this particular niche of late-stage, large-scale demonstration is an important element of a holistic innovation policy. I think that now, if we have a chance to pass stimulus legislation that supports some of these late-stage demonstration projects, we can kickstart markets in other technologies. Those technologies, for example, might be technologies that help us to split water to produce hydrogen, and that hydrogen can be used to decarbonize sources of emissions such as industrial emissions. There's a range of technologies, long duration storage, technologies to capture carbon dioxide. There's many technologies where we can apply this lesson that the scale up of a the large scale up of a commercially proven technology that just hasn't been proven at a great scale. If the government steps in and supports that last niche, it can really set up this launch pad for continued commercial market growth.
The last thing I wanted to ask you about, Varun, was the fact that you pointed to that there was a certain complementary role that state policy played through things like renewable portfolio standards or clean energy standards to be able to drive the deployment of solar in concert to the federal policy that we've talked about. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how that might be leveraged today?
Absolutely. So let me back up and say there are kind of 4 factors that are going into this decade-long solar boom that was launched in 2009 by the Recovery Act. The first factor is prices were falling kind of exogenously. There was in China a boom in investment in China in manufacturing capacity that happened to be stimulated in part by the demand from the United States. So kind of separately from everything we're talking about, there was the fall in solar panel prices. And I think it's important to say that because although the government played a pivotal role, you can't ascribe the entire boom just to the government. But the other 3 things I'm going to mention in this kind of 4-part framework do relate to government policy. One is the half a century of research and development that governments in the United States and Germany, Japan, and all over the world conducted. The United States was kind of first, it was a leader on this up until the 1980s. The second is the Recovery Act investment, and we talked about the loan guarantees. The third is what you brought up, Addison, which is even if these solar projects had achieved financial guarantees, it was also important to reduce the cost of deploying them and to guarantee some demand. And that last piece involves both federal and state incentives for the deployment of solar power. So you can see this full innovation pipeline being set up, where on one end of the pipeline, now I hope on Zoom this turns out to be the left side of your screen. If it's not, pretend it is. On one side of the innovation pipeline, you seed technologies by supporting research, development, and demonstration, and these promising technologies advance. And on the other side of the pipeline, you try and pull them out using demand pull policies, such as the investment tax credit, a federal incentive, or renewable portfolio standards, a state policy. In this particular case, California's renewable portfolio standard, which mandated that the state of California achieve a certain penetration of renewable energy, that RPS, or renewable portfolio standard, resulted in the demand to buy the power from these 5 first large-scale utility scale solar projects. PG&E, a utility in California, ended up being the off-taker for all of these projects. Without that critical source of demand that guaranteed a favorable price for the power for 25 years, these projects wouldn't have gotten built, even if they did enjoy the loan guarantee from the Recovery Act. So all these policies are working in harmony. And if we want to support other technologies, we're going to have this coordinated orchestration where you have research and development, demonstration, and these pull policies. Deployment support could be a carbon price, could be more targeted to pull these technologies out of the innovation pipeline and into the marketplace. So let's not forget the important role that states have played in the decade-long solar boom.
Varun, thank you very much for joining me. It was a fascinating conversation.
I had a great time. Thanks, Addison.